In the skies over the Persian Gulf, an F-14 Tomcat, the United States' premier fleet defender, cuts through the thin air at 30,000 feet. Suddenly, the fighter's radar scope shows 4 enemy contacts approaching in tight formation. The Tomcat's cutting-edge weapon system locks onto all 4 targets simultaneously. As the pilot's finger hovers over the launch button before unleashing a single AIM-54 Phoenix, the pinnacle of U.S. missile technology. The Phoenix streaks through the clouds at speeds nearing Mach 5, invisible to the enemy pilots below. In seconds, 3 MiG-23s vanish in brilliant orange fireballs that blossom against the blue sky. The 4th enemy fighter spins helplessly earthward, its wings sheared clean off by white-hot shrapnel, trailing black smoke like a dying comet. This state-of-the-art American weapon has just pulled off the most devastating single missile shot in aviation history. There's just one problem. It wasn't fired by the United States, but by one of its greatest enemies. In 1951, the U.S. Navy faced a difficult reality. Soviet Tu-4K Bull bombers, Stalin's reverse-engineered copies of the American B-29 Superfortress, could now launch anti-ship missiles from 100 miles away, well beyond the range of any defensive weapons the Navy possessed. In the event of an attack, American fighters would have to chase down the bombers after they'd already fired their missiles, making successful interception a matter of luck rather than tactics. Yet, as the Cold War continued to intensify throughout the 1950s, this tactical headache evolved into a full-blown existential threat. The sleek Tu-16 Badger bombers that began appearing in Soviet naval aviation units were faster, carried more powerful missiles, and operated in larger formations than their predecessors. Intelligence analysts warned that future Soviet bombers would be even more capable, potentially arriving in regimental-sized formations armed with nuclear-tipped cruise missiles and sophisticated electronic jamming equipment. The math was terrifying. Even a modest formation could launch dozens of missiles simultaneously from beyond the horizon. Yet the AIM-7 Sparrow, the U.S. Navy's primary medium-range missile, could barely reach 30 miles, meaning American fighters would have to get dangerously close to enemy bombers before engaging. By the time a U.S. aircraft got within Sparrow range, those Soviet cruise missiles would already be streaking toward American ships. What the Navy desperately needed was a weapon that could reach out and destroy enemy bombers before they could launch their deadly payloads, something that could engage multiple targets simultaneously across the vast distances of the open ocean. The survival of America's carrier fleets, and potentially the outcome of any future conflict, might depend on developing such a weapon. The Navy's first attempt at solving this crisis was the Douglas F-60 Missileer, a flying missile platform that looked more like a cargo plane than a fighter. Designed to carry the massive Bendix AAM-N10 Eagle missile, the Missileer was intended to loiter at the edge of enemy bomber formations and pick them off one by one at unprecedented ranges. On paper, it seemed perfect. The Eagle missile could reach targets 100 miles away, farther than any air-to-air weapon ever built. But the Missileer had one fatal flaw. It was painfully slow and unmaneuverable. The subsonic aircraft was designed purely as a missile carrier, with virtually no ability to dogfight or evade enemy fighters. Pentagon planners soon realized the enormous dangers their pilots would face in an aircraft that couldn't defend itself once the shooting started, and the program was quietly canceled in December 1960. The Navy's second attempt seemed more promising, but this time they took a different approach. Instead of starting from scratch, they decided to adapt technology that the Air Force had been working on. The USAF had been developing the AIM-47 Falcon missile for their XF-108 Rapier interceptor, but when that project was canceled, Hughes Aircraft found themselves with a revolutionary missile design and no aircraft to carry it. Meanwhile, the Navy had gotten involved in the Pentagon's new F-111B program, a carrier-based version of the Air Force's swing-wing fighter bomber that would serve as their long-range fleet defender. The F-111B needed a sophisticated missile system, and Hughes saw the perfect opportunity to adapt their orphaned AIM-47 technology for naval use. Hughes took their Falcon design and scaled it up, creating a larger, more capable weapon, initially designated AAMN-11, which would eventually become the AIM-54 Phoenix. The Phoenix inherited the Falcon's basic layout and guidance concepts, but was significantly bigger and more sophisticated. Weighing 1,000 pounds and stretching 13 feet long, the missile was designed to climb to altitudes above 80,000 feet and cruise at speeds approaching Mach 5, while it also featured a revolutionary active radar seeker that would activate in the final phase of flight. This meant the missile could go pitbull, switching to its own internal radar to hunt down targets, even if the launching aircraft was destroyed or had to retreat. To achieve this capability, Hughes had to miniaturize radar components that normally filled entire rooms into a package small enough to fit in the missile's nose cone. But it wasn't just the missile itself. Hughes also built an impressive integrated weapons system around it. The AN/AWG-9 radar, with its massive 36-inch antenna, could track up to 24 targets simultaneously and guide 6 Phoenix missiles at once against separate targets, something no aircraft had ever attempted before. Each missile could hunt independently once it went active, meaning a single aircraft could engage an entire formation of enemy bombers at ranges exceeding 100 nautical miles. There was just one problem. Each Phoenix missile would cost approximately $477,000, more than many complete aircraft. But the Pentagon considered it a worthwhile investment. The ability to stop a nuclear-armed bomber formation before it could threaten the fleet was literally priceless. Unfortunately, the F-111B quickly became a disaster. Overweight, underpowered, and dangerous on carrier approaches, the aircraft was canceled in 1968 after years of failed tests and cost overruns. However, the F-111B's weapons system, the AN/AWG radar, and AIM-54 Phoenix missile had proven they worked exactly as advertised. All the Navy needed now was an aircraft worthy of carrying them. The solution came in the form of the VFX program, the Navy's search for a new fleet defense fighter that could succeed where the F-111B had failed. In January 1969, Grumman Aircraft was awarded the contract to build what would become the F-14 Tomcat, and the company made a crucial decision. They would design their new fighter around the existing Phoenix weapons system rather than starting over. This wasn't just about saving money. It was about preserving a technological breakthrough. The AWG-9 radar represented years of cutting-edge development, capable of tracking 24 targets while simultaneously guiding 6 missiles to separate intercepts. No other radar system in the world could match its capabilities, and abandoning it would have set American fleet defense back by years. Grumman's engineers faced significant challenges integrating the massive weapons system into their new aircraft. The AWG-9 radar alone weighed over 1,400 pounds, while a full load of 6 Phoenix missiles added another 8,000 pounds to the aircraft. The F-14 had to be large enough and strong enough to carry this enormous payload, while still maintaining the speed and maneuverability needed for carrier operations. The first F-14 prototype took flight on December 21, 1970, with the Phoenix weapons system as its centerpiece. On April 28, 1972, an F-14 Tomcat launched the first AIM-54A Phoenix from Point Mugu, California. The test was a success. The missile performed exactly as designed, validating years of development work. But this was just the beginning of an intensive test program that would push both missile and aircraft to their limits. By December 20th, 1972, test pilots were attempting increasingly ambitious scenarios. Flying at Mach 0.7 and 31,500 feet, an F-14 crew accomplished something unprecedented, a 4-for-4 Phoenix test over the Pacific Missile Range. They launched 4 missiles in quick succession against 5 drone targets flying at various altitudes between 20 and 25,000 feet. One missile scored a direct hit, while the other 3 passed within their warhead's lethal zones, a perfect demonstration of the weapon's reliability. The test program was expensive beyond belief. Each Phoenix missile cost nearly $500,000, and by 1973, Hughes had fired 56 missiles during development trials, representing an investment of over $25 million in ammunition alone. Test officials later called it, quote, the most expensive single test of air-to-air missiles ever performed at that time. But the program achieved a remarkable 77% success rate, with 43 scored hits out of 56 launches from various aircraft. In April 1973, the weapon's potential was further demonstrated when an F-14 launched a Phoenix at a drone target 110 nautical miles away, shattering the previous long-range missile record of 76 miles and proving that Hughes' ambitious range claims weren't just marketing hype. However, the system's most ambitious test was yet to come. On November 21, 1973, Commander John "Smoke" Wilson climbed into his F-14, carrying 6 Phoenix missiles, the most expensive single weapons load in aviation history. Flying at Mach 0.78 and 24,800 feet, Wilson's radar intercept officer locked onto 6 separate drone targets spread across the sky 50 miles away. In just 38 seconds, Wilson launched all 6 missiles in rapid succession. The AWG-9 radar guided each Phoenix to a different target, while the crew watched in amazement as their tactical display tracked 6 simultaneous intercepts. 4 missiles scored direct hits, 1 lost lock and missed, and 1 was declared no test due to target drone malfunction. The 80% success rate was remarkable, but more importantly, the test proved that a single F-14 could engage an entire enemy formation, exactly what the Navy had been seeking since 1951. In September 1974, the AIM-54 Phoenix finally entered operational service with the U.S. Navy's VF-1 Wolfpack and VF-2 Bounty Hunters Tomcat squadrons aboard USS Enterprise. After more than a decade of development, America's fleet defenders were finally armed with the long-range weapon they desperately needed. However, the Phoenix's extraordinary cost created unexpected operational challenges. The weapon was so expensive that it created logistical nightmares for carrier operations. A full load of 6 Phoenix missiles weighed over 8,000 pounds, above the allowable bring-back load for safe carrier landings. This meant that if F-14s returned from missions with unfired Phoenix missiles, they would sometimes have to jettison the expensive weapons into the ocean, rather than risk a dangerous overweight landing. The most common operational loadout became a more practical mix of 2 Phoenix, 3 Sparrow, and 2 Sidewinder missiles. Nevertheless, the Phoenix helped the U.S. to wage psychological warfare against its communist rivals every day. When Soviet Tu-95 Bear bombers approached carrier battlegroups to test American defenses, F-14 crews would lock them up with their AWG-9 radars, a clear message that the visitors were well within Phoenix range. The effect was immediate and profound. Soviet crews knew they were being tracked by weapons that could destroy them long before they could complete their missions. It was clear they could no longer act with impunity, forcing them to completely rethink their attack profiles. This invisible shield of deterrence was exactly what the Phoenix had been designed to provide. The Cold War standoff that had driven its development meant that the missile's greatest victory was preventing the very conflict it was built to fight. It was the United States' ultimate insurance policy against nuclear annihilation from the sea. Yet elsewhere, a chain of events had been set in motion that would see the Phoenix take on a much more active role, in a way that nobody had expected. In January 1974, the Shah of Iran placed an order for 80 F-14 Tomcats and 714 Phoenix missiles, the largest foreign military sale in American history. Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was transforming Iran into a regional superpower, and he wanted the most advanced weapons money could buy to counter the growing Soviet threat on his northern border. The first Iranian F-14s arrived in 1976, operated by elite pilots who had trained alongside their American counterparts. Iranian crews quickly mastered the complex Phoenix system, and by 1979, Iran possessed the world's second largest fleet of these revolutionary weapons. Then everything changed. The Islamic Revolution swept the Shah from power in February 1979, transforming America's closest Middle Eastern ally into an implacable enemy overnight. The new Islamic Republic inherited one of the world's most sophisticated air forces, including those 79 F-14s and hundreds of Phoenix missiles. So when Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Iran the following year, it would be with considerable irony that the Phoenix would finally make its combat debut, not for the United States, but for one of its greatest adversaries. Fighting for their nation's survival with weapons their former allies desperately wished they could take back, Iranian F-14 pilots, isolated from American support and facing an enemy equipped with modern Soviet and French aircraft, had to make every shot count. The results were devastating. Iranian Tomcats began systematically destroying Iraqi aircraft at ranges the enemy couldn't match. MiG-21s, MiG-23s, and Mirage F-1s fell victim to Phoenix missiles fired from distances where the Iraqi pilots couldn't even see their attackers. On January 7, 1981, a single Phoenix missile, fired at a formation of 4 MiG-23s, managed to down 3 aircraft and damage the 4th, a feat that stunned military analysts worldwide. But as the war dragged on, Iran's Phoenix arsenal began to dwindle. Cut off from American spare parts and unable to purchase replacements, Iranian engineers became increasingly desperate. They launched Project Skyhawk in 1985, attempting to adapt IHawk surface-to-air missiles from their inventory for use on F-14s. The modified missiles were successfully tested in 1986 and even used in combat, but guidance problems forced the project's abandonment. The desperation was so acute the 2 Iranian F-14 pilots chose defection over continuing the hopeless fight. On August 31, 1986, an Iranian F-14A, armed with at least 1 Phoenix missile, landed in Iraq. Just 2 days later, on September 2nd, another Iranian Tomcat followed suit, delivering some of America's most advanced weapons directly into the hands of a nation the United States was quietly supporting. By late 1987, Iran's situation had become critical. Fewer than 50 operational Phoenix missiles remained in their inventory. The sophisticated missiles required fresh thermal batteries that could only be purchased from American suppliers, and Iran was forced to rely on clandestine buyers who charged up to $10,000 for each battery, nearly as much as an entire AIM-7 Sparrow missile cost. Despite these setbacks, Iranian pilots continued to extract an impressive toll from Iraqi forces. Throughout the 8-year Iran-Iraq War, Iranian F-14s claimed at least 160 Iraqi aircraft shot down, with many of these victories attributed to Phoenix missiles. By the conflict's end in 1988, the weapon that had been designed to stop Soviet bomber formations had proven equally lethal against fighters, bombers, and even cruise missiles in the hands of the United States' new enemy. Less than 2 years after the end of the war, history would repeat itself. Iraq, which the U.S. had supplied with technology, intelligence, and economic and diplomatic support during the conflict, invaded Kuwait in August 1990, triggering what would become the Gulf War. The country which the U.S. had backed to fight its former ally had now become a new enemy itself. Fortunately, the U.S. had stopped short of selling aircraft and missiles to Saddam Hussein. When Operation Desert Storm began in January 1991, American F-14 crews finally thought their moment had arrived to put the Phoenix into action. By this time, the weapon had evolved far beyond its original 1974 configuration. The improved AIM-54C, entering service in 1986, featured digital electronics replacing the original analog systems, and a new WDU-29B warhead that offered a 20 to 25% increase in effectiveness. Even more advanced were the sealed Phoenix missiles that had reached operational capability in 1988, eliminating the need for temperature conditioning liquid from the F-14 and allowing for greater operational flexibility. But while U.S. pilots were keen to test out these new capabilities, it would be easier said than done. The weapon's restrictive rules of engagement, designed for Cold War scenarios, proved problematic in the Gulf War's complex airspace. The F-14's powerful AWG-9 radar could detect Iraqi aircraft at extreme ranges, but strict ID friend-or-foe requirements prevented crews from engaging beyond visual range. The very capability that made the Phoenix revolutionary, its ability to down aircraft at distances where pilots couldn't visually identify their targets, became its limitation in a war where coalition aircraft filled the same airspace as enemy fighters. As a result, despite flying numerous combat missions, American F-14 crews never fired a single Phoenix missile during Desert Storm. The weapon sat unused beneath their aircraft, while shorter-range missiles and guns handled the few air-to-air engagements that occurred. However, following the war, the United States and its allies established no-fly zones over Iraq to protect Kurdish and Shia populations from Saddam Hussein's air forces. For several years after the end of the conflict, American and British aircraft patrolled these zones daily, enforcing UN resolutions, while Iraqi fighters periodically tested their resolve. On January 5, 1999, a pair of Iraqi MiG-25 Foxbats entered the no-fly zone over southern Iraq, only to be spotted by a pair of U.S. F-14s. The Tomcat crews fired 2 Phoenix missiles at the high-speed interceptors, the moment American pilots had trained for since the weapon entered service 25 years earlier. Disappointingly, both missiles failed. Rocket motor malfunctions prevented the Phoenix missiles from reaching their targets, leaving the Iraqi aircraft to escape unharmed. 8 months later, American crews got another chance. On September 9th, an F-14 launched a Phoenix at an Iraqi MiG-23 that had violated the southern no-fly zone. Again, the missile missed its target, and the Iraqi fighter escaped by turning north and fleeing at maximum speed. The problem wasn't the weapon itself. Iranian pilots had proven the Phoenix's effectiveness beyond doubt. Instead, American crews faced restrictive rules of engagement that prevented them from using the missile at its optimal range and altitude. Cold War procedures designed for engaging Soviet bombers proved inadequate for the cat-and-mouse games being played over Iraq, where enemy fighters would dart in and out of no-fly zones before disappearing. After 30 years of service and only 2 confirmed American launches, both unsuccessful, the Phoenix was officially retired from U.S. service on September 30th, 2004. The F-14 Tomcat followed 2 years later, ending an era that had begun with such promise during the height of the Cold War. The Phoenix's story was far from over. In Iran, the weapon would continue to evolve in ways its original designers never imagined. Cut off from American spare parts and technical support since 1979, Iranian engineers had spent decades reverse engineering and improving their Phoenix missiles. By 2013, they unveiled the Fakor 90, an upgraded version that looked almost identical to the original, but incorporated indigenous components and modern electronics. Iran had essentially built its own Phoenix, ensuring the weapon's survival long after the United States had abandoned it. Iran's determination to keep their F-14s operational became almost legendary among defense analysts. In 2010, Iranian Air Force commanders claimed they had installed Iran-made radar systems on their Tomcats, boasting that they could overhaul and optimize their aging fleet without any foreign assistance. Whether these claims were entirely accurate remained debatable, but Iran's F-14s continued to appear at military parades and in propaganda videos, defying decades of sanctions. In November 2015, the world got a dramatic demonstration of Iran's continued Phoenix capabilities when Iranian F-14s were spotted flying escort missions for Russian Tu-95, Tu-160, and Tu-22M bombers conducting airstrikes in Syria against ISIS targets. The sight of Iranian Tomcats, armed with American-designed Phoenix missiles, protecting Russian strategic bombers would have been unthinkable during the Cold War, yet it perfectly illustrated how far the geopolitical landscape had shifted. 10 years later, Israeli airstrikes during escalated regional tensions specifically targeted Iranian Tomcats on the ground. Video footage released by the Israeli Defense Forces showed the destruction of at least 5 F-14s, a clear indication that even after nearly 5 decades, the Phoenix-armed Tomcat remained a weapon system worthy of preemptive attack. Meanwhile, the U.S. military found itself without any long-range air-to-air capability for the first time since 1974. This gap hadn't been for lack of trying. In the late 1980s, the Pentagon had launched the Advanced Air-to-Air Missile Program, the AIM-152 AAAM, intended as the Phoenix's successor. The new weapon promised to be smaller, faster, and more capable than its predecessor, designed to arm both Navy and Air Force fighters. But with the Cold War's end and the Soviet bomber threat evaporating, Congress canceled the program in 1992, leaving no replacement for the Phoenix's unique capabilities. For 2 decades, American fighter pilots made do with shorter-range missiles, even as potential adversaries developed increasingly sophisticated long-range threats. China and Russia fielded their own extended-range air-to-air missiles, while Iran continued to operate its Phoenix-armed F-14s and indigenous Fakor 90s. Finally, in 2024, the U.S. Navy began fielding the AIM-174, essentially a ship-launched standard missile adapted for air-to-air use. With a range exceeding 240 miles, it represented the first dedicated long-range American air-to-air missile since the Phoenix's retirement 20 years earlier. The wheel had come full circle. More than 7 decades after the Tu-4K Bull first demonstrated the need for long-range air-to-air missiles, the United States was once again arming its fighters with weapons capable of engaging threats at extreme distances.